It all began with something simple: a backyard barbecue, the kind of ordinary gathering that most people look forward to on a sunny weekend. The grill was fired up, the smell of sizzling burgers filled the air, and laughter drifted across the fence. Families, friends, and neighbors came together, enjoying food, music, and conversation in the warm glow of the afternoon. To me, it was just a tradition, a way to unwind from the long work week, connect with the people around me, and share a meal under the open sky. But not everyone saw it that way. Just 2 houses down lived someone who seemed to thrive on disapproval, someone who had a unique talent for turning joy into irritation. She was the self-appointed guardian of peace in the neighborhood, though her version of peace was less about harmony and more about control. Her name was Karen. Karen despised my barbecues. It wasn't the food, and it wasn't the company. It wasn't even the music, which I always kept at a reasonable level. No, Karen's complaint was about the smoke. She claimed it drifted directly into her home, invading her pristine living space, tainting her curtains, and ruining her so-called fresh air. She acted as though my small charcoal grill was a chemical factory belching toxins into the atmosphere. The first complaint came, quietly enough. A formal letter slipped into my mailbox bearing the HOA's emblem. It was short to the point and entirely impersonal. Cease outdoor grilling activities that produce smoke. That was it. No greeting, no explanation, no signature. Just a demand. At first, I thought it had to be some sort of mistake. After all, everyone in the neighborhood barbecued. During the summer, you could practically follow the scent of grilled steak and chicken from one street to another. Why single me out? But as I asked around, I realized no one else had been targeted. It was only me. And it didn't take much imagination to figure out why. Karen's house sat just close enough that she could see into my backyard from her upstairs window. She had a direct view of my grill, the gathering, the laughter, and the smoke that drifted lazily upward. It wasn't about the smoke. It was about control. I ignored the letter. Not out of rebellion, but because I truly thought it couldn't be serious. Surely the HOA had better things to do than police backyard burgers. But the following weekend, when I hosted another barbecue, the second letter arrived. This time it was longer, sterner, and carried a threat. Failure to comply, it said, would result in fines. That's when I knew Karen was behind it. The HOA board rarely acted unless someone pushed them, and Karen had a reputation for being relentless. She wasn't even a board member, but she attended every meeting, wrote long complaint emails, and made sure her voice was always the loudest. People joked that she was the shadow president, and now I was caught in her spotlight. The fines began small, $50, then $100. They came with each weekend barbecue, piling up like kindling for a fire. I considered stopping, but every time I thought about it, I grew angrier. Why should I give up something so normal, something so harmless, just to appease one person? Everyone else enjoyed the gatherings. No one else complained. It was unfair, unreasonable, and downright petty. So I kept grilling. Karen escalated. She began documenting the parties, snapping photos from her window, sending them to the HOA as evidence. She claimed the smoke violated air quality standards. She claimed the noise from laughter and clinking glasses disturbed her peace. She even alleged that my guests were trespassing on her property, though they never set foot near her yard. Each complaint was more exaggerated than the last, but each one pushed the HOA to act harder. Soon, I was summoned to a board hearing. A formal gathering in the community center where I sat before a panel of grim-faced board members while Karen sat in the front row, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk plastered across her face. She spoke at length about her suffering, about how her home had become unlivable because of the smoke, how she had to run air purifiers day and night, how her quality of life had plummeted because of me. The board issued a final warning: stop the barbecues or face escalating fines and potential legal action. I walked out of that meeting furious, humiliated, and yet strangely determined. This wasn't just about grilling anymore. It was about principle, about standing up to someone who believed she could control the entire neighborhood with complaints and threats. I wasn't about to let Karen dictate how I lived my life. That night, as I stood in my backyard staring at the grill, a plan began to form. If Karen hated my barbecues so much, what would happen if they weren't just my barbecues anymore? What if the entire neighborhood joined in? She couldn't complain. About everyone. She couldn't find the whole block. If my little gatherings were enough to rattle her, then a neighborhood-wide cookout would drive her mad. The idea took root quickly. I began quietly talking to my neighbors, explaining the situation, sharing the letters, and asking for their support. To my surprise, they rallied behind me. Many of them had their own stories about Karen's meddling, her constant complaints, her attempts to enforce rules that didn't exist. They were tired of her too. And the thought of one giant cookout, a party that would unite the neighborhood and drown out Karen's disapproval, was too good to resist. Plans were made. Invitations spread like wildfire. People offered to bring side dishes, extra grills, even speakers for music. It was no longer just my barbecue, it was everyone's. And as the weekend approached, I could almost feel the tension in the air. Karen had no idea what was coming. The stage was set for a showdown unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. The morning of the great cookout arrived with a sky so clear, it felt like nature itself had blessed the plan. The sun rose golden and unyielding, casting long streaks of light across neatly trimmed lawns and quiet cul-de-sacs. Normally, Saturdays in our neighborhood meant routine chores, lawnmowers humming, sprinklers ticking, and the faint buzz of garage doors opening. But that day, something different stirred. There was a collective energy in the air. Neighbors who rarely spoke beyond. A polite wave were out early, setting up folding tables, coolers, and lawn chairs. The grassy strip by the community park began filling with canopies, grills, and the clatter of cooking utensils. The idea had spread further than I imagined. What began as a simple act of defiance had transformed into a block-wide festival. At first, I felt a pang of anxiety. Had I gone too far? After all, the HOA's threats were still fresh in my mind. But as I saw families carrying trays of marinated meat, kids running with balloons, and even retirees setting up lawn games, the nervousness faded. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone. Word of Karen's complaints had spread. Quickly once I shared my story, it seemed nearly every household had been touched by her in some way. One family recalled how she reported them for leaving a basketball hoop by their driveway. Another spoke of how she demanded they paint their shutters because the color clashed with the neighborhood palette. Even the couple across the street, who rarely interacted with anyone, revealed that she had called animal control on their perfectly healthy cat. The neighborhood's collective grievances had simmered quietly for years, but now they had a spark, and that spark was about to ignite. By noon, the smell of charcoal, hickory smoke, and sizzling meat filled the air, drifting like an open challenge toward Karen's pristine white house. Music floated from portable speakers, blending into a lively mix of laughter, chatter, and clinking soda cans. The atmosphere was festive, almost celebratory, like a block party that had been waiting to happen all along. From my backyard, I could see Karen's blinds twitch. She was watching. Of course she was. Her kingdom of control was crumbling, and she knew it. She had tried to isolate me, to make an example out of my barbecues, but instead, she had united the neighborhood against. Her neighbors came up to me throughout the afternoon, clapping me on the back, thanking me for standing up. Some even joked that I had started a revolution. I laughed along, but deep inside, I understood the gravity of it. This was no longer petty. It was symbolic. It was everyone saying enough. The cookout rolled on, growing bigger by the hour. Cars lined the street as more people arrived, some from nearby blocks who had caught wind of the gathering. Tables overflowed with food, ribs, burgers, hot dogs, kebabs, every variety of side dish imaginable. Children ran freely, their laughter a sharp contrast to the stiff silence Karen usually tried to enforce. Even the older residents, who often kept to themselves, joined in, sharing stories of the neighborhood's past and toasting with lemonade under the shade of canopies. But amidst the joy, tension simmered. Everyone knew Karen wouldn't stay silent. For long. It wasn't in her nature. The first sign came in the form of her car. A shiny silver sedan, always spotless, pulled out of her driveway slowly, deliberately. She drove around the block twice, glaring out her window as though patrolling for violations. People noticed, but no one stopped their fun. If anything, the energy grew bolder. Someone turned the music up slightly louder, and cheers erupted as if to mock her watchful eyes. She disappeared after her little patrol. But I knew she was plotting, sure. Enough. About an hour later, two men in polo shirts with clipboards appeared. HOA representatives. They walked stiffly, scanning the scene with obvious discomfort. This wasn't what they expected when they agreed to investigate one homeowner's complaints. What they saw was a unified neighborhood, smiling, laughing, and enjoying themselves. Dozens of grills smoked gently in the sun, sending up a cloud that hovered like a banner of rebellion. The rep spoke to me briefly, reminding me of the HOA's position on smoke disturbances and noise levels. But even as they said the words, their voices faltered. They could see that this was no isolated incident. If they cracked down on me, they would have to crack down on everyone here. That was a fight they couldn't win. They left after a few awkward minutes, and the moment they were gone, the party roared back to life with renewed energy. Karen's next move was more desperate. From my yard, I saw her pacing her porch with a phone pressed tightly to her ear. She gestured wildly, pointing toward the gathering, her face flushed with frustration. It didn't take long to guess who she was calling. And sure enough, Les. Then half an hour later, the sound of sirens pierced the air. A police cruiser rolled down the street, its lights flashing quietly, almost apologetically. The crowd fell silent for a moment, but then laughter broke out again, lighter this time, as if to say, "We knew this was coming." The officers stepped out, clearly uncomfortable. They walked slowly toward the heart of the cookout, speaking calmly to a few neighbors. Karen emerged from her house like a general leading troops, striding up to the officers with a flurry of complaints spilling from her lips. She pointed to the smoke, the music, the cars, the people. She spoke as though she were describing a riot instead of a cookout, but the officers didn't share her view. They saw families, children, food, and laughter. They saw a neighborhood simply enjoying itself. After a few questions, they told us to keep the noise at a reasonable level and drove away. Karen was left standing in the middle of the street, her plan foiled once again. The sight of her, red-faced and fuming while the neighborhood erupted, back into laughter, was something no one would forget. Yet, as the sun dipped lower and the glow of the grills gave way to the shimmer of string lights, I knew this wasn't over. Karen had been embarrassed, publicly humiliated, and left powerless in front of the very people she wanted to control. People like her don't let go. They double down. And deep inside, I wondered what her next move would be. The morning after the great cookout was strangely quiet. The laughter had faded, the grills had cooled, and the smell of smoke was nothing but a faint memory. Yet despite the calm, I knew Karen was awake in her house, plotting. The humiliation of the previous day would not sit well with her. People like Karen don't retreat. They regroup, sharpen their claws, and come back louder, angrier, and more determined than before. I didn't have to wait long to see the first signs. A fresh envelope arrived in my mailbox, stamped with the HOA's crest. Inside, the words were sharp and urgent. Effective immediately. Outdoor smoke-producing activities are under review. Violations may result in fines, suspension of privileges, or legal escalation. The language was vague, but the meaning was clear. This was Karen's doing. She had run to the board again, demanding action, and this time she had their ears. Throughout the week, I noticed her movements more closely. She wasn't just complaining anymore. She was campaigning. She stopped neighbors on the street, cornering them with stories about how the smoke was toxic and life-threatening. She spread wild claims about property values plummeting because of constant disturbances. Her voice carried like a warning siren, and though many brushed her off, others grew wary. Not everyone had the stomach for conflict. By Thursday, a notice went out. A special HOA meeting would be held to discuss community health and safety concerns. No one needed to guess who had pushed for it. Karen had managed to escalate her personal vendetta into a neighborhood-wide crisis. In the days leading up to the meeting, I could feel the shift in energy. Some neighbors who had laughed at the cookout began to worry. What if the HOA imposed massive fines? What if they threatened liens or lawsuits? The fear of financial punishment ran deep, and Karen knew exactly how to exploit it. She didn't need everyone to side with her. She only needed to scare enough people into silence, but while Karen was busy stirring panic, I was quietly preparing. I refused to let her dictate the terms of our community without a fight. I dug through the HOA's governing documents. Pages of dry bylaws and regulations that most people never bothered to read. And buried in the legal jargon, I found something Karen had overlooked. The HOA couldn't simply create new rules out of thin air. Major restrictions required a vote from the homeowners themselves. A majority vote. Karen might control the board through her constant pressure, But she didn't control the people. Armed with that knowledge, I started talking to neighbors again. I reminded them of the cookout, the unity, the laughter. I reminded them that Karen's complaints weren't about smoke but about control. And slowly the fear began to lift. Families who had once hesitated promised they'd attend the meeting. Parents who had suffered Karen's nitpicking vowed they'd speak up. The same neighbors she had alienated over the years were ready to push back. The night of the meeting arrived, and the community center filled with more people than I had ever seen at one of these gatherings. Folding chairs lined the room, neighbors squeezed shoulder to shoulder, and a low murmur of anticipation buzzed in the air. At the front of the room sat the HOA board, their faces tense, papers neatly stacked before them. And just to their right sat Karen, perched proudly, arms crossed, eyes gleaming with the certainty of victory. The meeting opened with the usual formality, but it wasn't long before Karen seized the floor. She stood tall, her voice projecting like a prosecutor presenting her case. She painted a picture of endless smoke clouds choking the neighborhood, of sleepless nights ruined by noise, of children coughing and pets suffering. Her words dripped. With exaggeration, each claim more dramatic than the last. And with every sentence, she cast herself as the victim, the lone defender of the neighborhood's quality of life. For a moment, the room was quiet. Karen had spoken forcefully, and her presence was commanding. But then, a hand rose. It was my neighbor from across the street, the one whose cat she had reported. He calmly told his story about how Karen's constant interference had nearly cost them their pet. Another neighbor followed, recalling how she had demanded they remove a swing set for their children because it was unsightly. One by one, voices rose and the tide began to turn. When it was my turn, I stood with the HOA bylaws in hand. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply laid out the facts. Gatherings of a reasonable and social nature were explicitly protected. Restrictions required a majority homeowner vote, and none had been taken. The board, I explained, had no authority to impose Karen's will on the community. The room stirred. Heads nodded. People whispered in agreement. The power Karen thought she wielded was unraveling right before her eyes. Karen's face reddened as I spoke. She interrupted, protested, waved her hands wildly, but the board silenced her. They couldn't ignore the rules written in their own documents. They couldn't ignore the rising voices of a neighborhood united. By the time the meeting adjourned, it was clear. Karen hadn't won. She had overplayed her hand. The board, cornered by both the bylaws and the will of the people, announced that no new restrictions would be enacted without a community vote. And judging by the reaction in that room, Karen's chances of winning such a vote were slim. As neighbors filed out, some smiling, others patting me on the back, Karen stormed out through the side door. Her heels clicked angrily against the tile, her posture rigid with rage. She had tried to bend the HOA into her personal weapon, and it had backfired. But I knew this wasn't the end. Karen didn't strike me as the kind of person to accept defeat gracefully. She had been embarrassed twice now, once at the cookout and once at the meeting, and humiliation, for someone like her, was fuel. I walked home under the glow of the streetlights, the cool night air carrying a strange mix of relief and dread. The neighborhood had stood strong, and for now, we were safe. But deep inside, I could feel it. Karen wasn't finished. She would find another way to attack, and when she did, it wouldn't be through the HOA. Her war was about to go beyond the neighborhood. The days following the HOA meeting carried a strange calm. Neighbors smiled more often, waved more freely, and even lingered in their front yards to chat. It was as if a cloud had lifted, a heavy presence shaken off after years of being quietly tolerated. For the first time, people openly joked about Karen, calling her the smoke police and the grill warden. It felt like we had won, but I knew better. Karen had been beaten twice now, once in the court of public opinion and once in the boardroom of the HOA. She wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly. She would look for cracks, weaknesses, and ways to twist the system again. The question wasn't if she'd strike back, but how. The answer came sooner than expected. A thick packet appeared in everyone's mailbox one Thursday morning. It was labeled Emergency HOA Rule Amendments and bore the board's seal. Inside was a draft of proposed new restrictions, written with an unmistakable bias. The language was vague, but the target was clear. Any outdoor activities producing excessive smoke, odors, or disturbances may be subject to disciplinary action. It was Karen's vendetta, dressed up in official jargon. The fine print was worse. Violations would start at $250 per incident, escalating with repeat offenses. The rules gave the board broad authority to interpret excessive however they saw fit. And at the bottom, in bold letters, was a date, a homeowner vote. Scheduled for 2 weeks from that day, Karen had managed to push her agenda further than before. The board, cornered by her relentless pressure, had agreed to present her rules to the community. If they passed, every barbecue, every smoke trail from a grill could become a punishable offense. Fear returned to the neighborhood like a creeping shadow. I could see it in the way people avoided conversations about grilling, in the nervous glances exchanged across lawns. No one wanted to pay hundreds in fines. No one wanted legal trouble. Karen had found a new way to tighten her grip, and this time, she was closer than ever to victory. But I had something she didn't. I had the bylaws. In the evenings, I sat at my kitchen table with a highlighter and notebook, combing through the thick stack of HOA documents. They were tedious, filled with dense language, but the more I read, the clearer the picture became. Karen's proposed amendments weren't just unfair, they were sloppy. For one, the bylaws required a 2/3 majority of homeowners for any changes to restrictions that affected use and enjoyment of private property. That meant Karen couldn't just scare people into silence. She needed overwhelming support. And more importantly, there was an existing clause buried deep in the rules, a protection for reasonable social gatherings that explicitly included outdoor cooking, provided noise and safety standards, were met. It was vague, yes, but it was there in black and white. If push came to shove, it would serve as a shield against her proposals. I knew the battle would be won not with anger, but with preparation, so I went door to door. At first, people were hesitant. Many had seen how relentless Karen could be and didn't want to draw her wrath. But when I showed them the bylaws, the highlighted passages, and explained how Karen's proposals were not only unfair, but unenforceable without a 2/3 majority, I saw the doubt begin to fade. Neighbors who had once shrugged nervously began to nod with determination. Stories poured out again, reminders of how Karen had intruded in their lives. The basketball hoop complaint, the swing set demand, the false reports to animal control. People hadn't forgotten. They had simply been waiting for an opportunity to fight back. That opportunity was now. By the time the day of the vote arrived, the community center was packed once again. Folding chairs scraped against the linoleum floors, papers rustled, and a nervous buzz filled the room. At the front sat the board, flanked once again by Karen, who looked smug and victorious. She had dressed the part of a conqueror, her hair styled, her posture rigid, her lips curled in a faint smile. The meeting began with Karen's performance. She spoke at length about the hazards of smoke, the constant disruptions, and the threat to property values. Her tone was urgent, persuasive, even theatrical. She waved a folder of complaints as though it were a sacred text, pointing toward me more than once as the prime example of the problem. But when she finished, the floor opened for others to speak. Neighbors rose one by one. Some were measured, calmly stating that gatherings were a normal part of community life. Others were fiery, recounting years of harassment and petty reports. A few waved their own copies of the bylaws I had shared, pointing directly to the clauses that contradicted. Karen's proposals. Finally, I stood. I didn't attack her. I didn't need to. Instead, I laid out the facts. The bylaws protected outdoor cooking. The proposed amendments required a 2/3 majority, not a simple majority. And even if passed, the vague language left them vulnerable to legal challenge. As I spoke, I saw the board members shifting in their seats. They weren't comfortable anymore. They could see the room wasn't behind Karen. They could see the flaws in her proposals. And most importantly, they could feel the unity of the neighborhood rising against her. The vote was taken by secret ballot. The room fell into a tense silence as slips of paper were collected, counted, and recounted. Karen's eyes darted nervously. Now, her confidence beginning to crack. When the results were announced, the outcome was decisive. The amendments had failed, not even close to the 2/3 majority required. The room erupted into applause, cheers echoing off the walls. For the second time in weeks, Karen had been defeated. And this time, it wasn't just by me. It was by the will of the entire neighborhood. Karen stood abruptly, her chair screeching across the floor. She muttered something under her breath, grabbed her folder, and stormed out, her face a mask of rage. The board adjourned quickly after, their own relief obvious. As neighbors celebrated, shaking hands and clapping shoulders, I couldn't help but glance toward the door Karen had slammed. Shut behind her. She had lost again, humiliated in front of everyone she sought to control. And humiliation for someone like her wasn't the end. It was gasoline on a fire. Karen wouldn't stop at the HOA anymore. She would take her war higher, further, beyond. The reach of neighborhood bylaws. I had won another round, but I knew the fiercest battle was yet to come. The neighborhood's victory at the ballot box should have been the end. The people had spoken, the rules had failed, and life should have returned to normal. But with Karen, nothing was ever that simple. She had lost the HOA battle twice. She had been humiliated at the cookout, mocked at the board meeting, and dismissed at the community vote. For most, those defeats would have been enough to step back, swallow pride, and move on. But Karen didn't think like most people. She wasn't just angry, she was consumed. Every time she looked out her window and saw neighbors smiling, grilling, or simply enjoying themselves, it must have felt like a dagger twisting deeper into her pride. And when control slipped from her hands, she did what people like her always do. She went higher. It started with whispers of city involvement. A neighbor mentioned seeing a municipal car parked near Karen's driveway one morning. Another said they overheard her bragging about making calls to the right people downtown. Before long, it became clear Karen had turned her vendetta outward. If the HOA wouldn't bend to her will, she would summon outside forces to enforce it. The first visit came on a Tuesday afternoon. A city inspector arrived, clipboard in hand, walking slowly down the block. He stopped in front of my house, peering at the backyard fence, scribbling notes as though he were surveying a crime scene. He was polite enough when I approached, explaining that a complaint had been filed regarding nuisance smoke and potential air quality violations. He asked questions about the grill, how often it was used, whether it was charcoal or gas. It didn't take much imagination to know who filed the complaint. The inspector left with little to show for it, muttering something about well within residential limits, but his presence had already done its damage. Neighbors grew uneasy. If Karen could summon the city once, she could do it again. And who knew what other codes or ordinances she would try to weaponize? Sure enough, over the next 2 weeks, more officials appeared. A zoning officer checking to see if gatherings required permits, a sanitation inspector supposedly responding to food waste concerns, even animal control again, though there hadn't been a single issue with pets in months. Each visit ended the same. Nothing found, nothing cited, nothing wrong. But the message was clear. Karen was trying to drown us in red tape, hoping someone, somewhere, would stick. But here's the thing about Karen. She was so obsessed with everyone else's lives that she forgot to guard her own. One afternoon, as the sanitation inspector wrapped up yet another fruitless check, he glanced toward Karen's property. His brow furrowed. I followed his gaze and saw it too. The extension on the back of her house. A sunroom that hadn't always been there. It had gone up quietly a year earlier. A gleaming structure of glass and wood that she bragged about to anyone who would listen. She claimed it added tens of thousands in value to her home. The inspector asked a simple question. Was that permitted? Neighbors nearby chuckled knowingly. Karen had cut corners, skipping permits to avoid fees and paperwork. Everyone knew it, though most had stayed silent, unwilling to invite her wrath. But now, her weaponizing of city officials had turned the spotlight back onto her. The inspector took notes, made a call, and within days, Karen's prized sunroom became the subject of official investigation. The fallout was swift. A letter was posted to her door. A notice of violation. The city demanded permits, architectural reviews, and fees for every missed step in the process. Fines began stacking up, thousands of dollars at a time, dwarfing anything she had tried to impose on me or anyone else. Worse still, until the issues were resolved, her sunroom was declared unusable. She had turned her supposed crown jewel into a boarded-up embarrassment, visible to every passerby. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who had once feared her now laughed openly about the irony. Karen, the self-proclaimed guardian of rules, had been caught breaking them herself. But the unraveling didn't stop there. The zoning officer, now familiar with the block thanks to Karen's constant complaints, began looking closer at her property. It turned out her beloved manicured hedges extended several feet beyond her boundary line, encroaching on community space. Another violation. Then came the discovery that her short-term rental, the occasional visiting cousin that everyone suspected was actually paying guests, was operating without proper registration. Another violation. Each complaint Karen had filed brought another set of eyes to the neighborhood, and each set of eyes found more problems with her own house than with anyone else's. The irony was delicious. The woman who had tried to weaponize authority against everyone else had instead turned that same authority against herself, and the neighborhood noticed. People began hosting barbecues more often, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single weekend. They weren't hiding anymore. They were celebrating. Music played, kids laughed, grills smoked freely, and no one looked over their shoulder in fear of Karen's wrath. Her power had been broken, her voice drowned out by the sound of sizzling burgers and clinking soda cans. Karen, meanwhile, withdrew. Her blinds stayed shut. Her car rarely left the driveway, and the once proud figure who strutted through HOA meetings now avoided eye contact with anyone. The humiliation had grown too heavy, the costs too high, the battles too many. But even in her silence, she lingered like a storm cloud at the edge of the sky. The war might have been lost, but her bitterness hadn't vanished. Everyone knew she was stewing behind those closed blinds, watching, waiting, wishing for some last opportunity to strike back. For me, though, the victory wasn't about silencing her. It was about something bigger. The neighborhood, once fractured by fear of her complaints, was now closer than ever. Families gathered, friendships grew, and people stood up for one another in ways they hadn't before. Karen's obsession had united us. Her rage had forged our resilience. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching smoke curl lazily from 3 different grills on the block, I realized something. Karen's last stand wasn't a cookout or a board meeting or even a city inspection. It was her own downfall, brought on by her inability to let go, her need to control, her blind spot for her own flaws. And though she might still glare from behind her blinds, the truth was undeniable. Karen no longer ruled this neighborhood. Summer had returned in full force by the time the neighborhood decided it was time. The air was warm, the evenings stretched long and golden, and the memory of Karen's failed crusades had settled into a kind of legend. People still joked about the great smoke wars of last year, laughing about her frantic patrols, her endless complaints, and the way her own violations had finally brought her down. But beneath the laughter was something more serious, a sense of freedom, a recognition that we had taken our community back. And so the idea was born. One final cookout, not just any gathering, but the biggest one yet. A celebration, a statement, and a thank you to everyone who had stood up, spoken out, and refused to bow to fear. Planning began weeks in advance. Flyers were passed out, group chats buzzed with excitement, and volunteers stepped forward to provide everything from food to music to decorations. This time, it wasn't just my backyard or even the park strip. The cookout would be held in the heart of the community. The very same green space where Karen had once complained about noise and smoke drifting her way. When the day finally came, the transformation was stunning. Long tables stretched across the grass, covered in checkered cloths and stacked high with food. Grills of every size and shape lined the perimeter, smoke rising like banners of victory. Balloons fluttered from lampposts, children darted between. Lawn games and a band of local teens tuned their instruments under a canopy. It wasn't just a cookout anymore. It was a festival. As I walked through the crowd, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now greeted each other like old friends. Parents swapped recipes, retirees shared stories, and kids formed teams for improvised soccer matches on the lawn. The same people who had once lived under the shadow of Karen's watchful eye were now free, open, and joyful. Of course, Karen was still there, in her house at the edge of the green. Her blinds twitched occasionally, a reminder that she was watching, though she hadn't dared to show her face in months. The city fines had piled up, her illegal sunroom remained shuttered, and her influence over the HOA had evaporated completely. She was a ghost of her former self, a cautionary tale of what happens when control becomes obsession. And yet, in a way, her presence made the celebration sweeter. Every laugh, every sizzle of meat on the grill, every cheer that rang across the lawn was a reminder of what she had tried and failed to take away. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the cookout reached its peak. Music played, neighbors danced, and plates overflowed with food. I stood near my grill, flipping burgers, when an elderly neighbor approached. She had lived in the community longer than anyone, quiet and reserved, rarely speaking during all of Karen's antics. But now she smiled and told me something I'll never forget. "We should have done this years ago." Her words struck me. The truth was, Karen hadn't just been an antagonist. She had been a mirror, reflecting back all the fear and hesitation we had allowed to build over time. For years, people had kept their heads down, avoided conflict, and let her dictate the rhythm of the neighborhood. It had taken her going too far, pushing too hard, for us to finally push back. And in doing so, we found each other. By dusk, string. Lights glowed across the green, casting a warm, festive shimmer over the crowd. Smoke curled gently into the sky, no longer a weapon in Karen's arsenal, but a symbol of freedom, resilience, and unity. Someone gave a short toast. Nothing formal, just a few heartfelt words about community, laughter, and never letting one person control the many again. Glasses clinked, cheers rose, and the music swelled. For the first time in years, I looked around and realized the neighborhood truly belonged to us. Not the HOA, not the rules, and certainly not Karen. It belonged to the families who laughed together, the children who played together, and the neighbors who had finally learned to stand together. Karen's blinds remained shut all night. Some whispered that she was inside fuming silently, but others thought she had finally accepted her defeat. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. The neighborhood no longer revolved around her. As the night wound down and the last embers of the grills faded, I sat with a plate of food in my lap, watching the glow of the string lights flicker softly. I thought about how it all began. One small barbecue, one petty complaint, one woman determined to ruin everyone else's joy. And I thought about how far it had come. An entire neighborhood united, stronger than before, bonded by smoke, laughter, and a shared refusal to bow down. The final cookout wasn't just a party, it was proof that Karen's reign was over. And as I sat there, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and the hum of a community alive again, I couldn't help but smile. Karen hated my barbecues. And that's exactly why the whole neighborhood came together to make sure we'd never stop.